The bailiff's voice landed like a stone in still water. "All rise for the Honorable Justice Calloway." I walked through the side door, robes on, folder in hand, eyes straight ahead. 22 years on the bench. Well, not the bench yet. I was still a lawyer then, but 22 years of courtrooms, and I had learned how to keep my face completely still. It's a skill you develop when you grow up having to hide everything. I took my seat. I set down my papers, and only then did I let myself look at the two people sitting at the plaintiff's table. My mother was wearing a blue blazer. She'd done her hair. My father had on a tie, gray, slightly crooked. They looked like grandparents showing up to a school recital. Respectable, wholesome, harmless. They didn't recognize me yet. That would change. I need to go back. I need to go all the way back to a Tuesday morning in late October 1994 in the departures level of Vancouver International Airport. I was 6 years old. I was wearing a red coat with brown buttons, and I was holding a stuffed rabbit that had one ear slightly floppier than the other because I had chewed on it in my sleep since I was 2. My father, my biological father, knelt down in front of me. He smelled like the inside of our car. He said, "Stay right here by this pillar. Don't move. We're going to check something at the counter and we'll be right back." My mother, my biological mother, didn't say anything. She was already walking away. I waited. I counted the tiles on the floor because that's what I did when I was nervous. I got to 40-something and lost count and started again. People moved around me with suitcases and rolling bags. A woman in a yellow scarf smiled at me, and I smiled back because my mother had always told me to be polite. They did not come back. I don't know how long I stood there before a woman from the airport approached me. She was wearing a navy vest and had a kind face, and she crouched down and said, "Are you lost, sweetheart?" And I said, very seriously, "No, I'm waiting." And she said, "How long have you been waiting?" And I said I didn't know. She took my hand and brought me to a back office that had a plastic chair and a box of crayons and a wall phone. She called someone. Then someone else came. Then a man in a police uniform. I drank a juice box and drew a picture of my rabbit on a piece of airport stationery. My parents, my biological parents, were on a flight to Calgary by then. I found this out much later. That part took years. The Children's Aid Society placed me in a foster home in Burnaby. The foster mother was a tired woman named Elaine who cooked very good soup and had 4 other children in the house and watched the news every night at 6. She wasn't unkind. She was just stretched too thin for any of us to get much of her. I slept in a room with 2 other girls. I kept my rabbit on the pillow. I was there for 8 months. In the summer of 1995, I was matched with a man named Bernard. He was 53, recently widowed, a retired high school history teacher who lived in a small house in Quitlam with a vegetable garden in the backyard and more books than I had ever seen in one place that wasn't a library. He had applied to foster and then to adopt because his wife had always wanted children and they had never been able to have them, and when she died of a stroke the year before, he said he decided that carrying out that wish was the only thing that made sense to him. That is what he told me when I was old enough to understand it. He didn't sugarcoat things. He believed in telling children the truth in a way that was gentle but honest, and he said that was the most important thing a history teacher could do. Show people that the truth, however difficult, is always more useful than a comfortable fiction. I called him Bernard for about 2 years. Then one evening, he was helping me with a school project about family trees, and I asked him what I should put in the box where it said Father, and he said very quietly, "Whatever feels true to you." I wrote his name in the box. He didn't say anything. He just nodded once and went back to stirring his tea. After that, I called him Dad. I was not an easy child in the years immediately after the airport. I had nightmares. I was anxious in crowds and near large windows and anywhere that felt too open, too easy to leave. I had trouble trusting adults in ways that I couldn't always articulate. Bernard was patient with all of it in a way that still astonishes me when I think about it. He never rushed me. He never pushed. He went to every parent-teacher meeting and every school play, and when I won a public speaking award in grade 8, he cried in the auditorium and pretended he wasn't. He put me through university. I studied law at UBC because I had grown up, knowing that systems could fail children, and I wanted to understand the machinery of those systems from the inside. I articled in Vancouver. I worked in family law for 6 years before moving into estates. Bernard was proud in the quiet, steady way that was entirely his own. He got his first cancer diagnosis when I was 28, prostate. They caught it early and treated it, and he recovered. We didn't talk about it much. He was not a man who liked to dwell. The second diagnosis came when I was 31, lung this time, which surprised everyone because he had never smoked a day in his life. He was 79. He dealt with it the same way he dealt with most things, methodically, without drama, with a kind of clear-eyed acceptance that I found both admirable and, privately, devastating. He died in the spring, on a Thursday morning, with me sitting beside him in the hospice on Shaughnessy Street, holding his hand. I did not cry until I was in the parking lot. Then I sat in my car for 40 minutes. His estate went through probate in the normal way. Bernard had been careful with money his whole life, not wealthy by any dramatic measure, but deliberate. A paid-off house in Coquitlam that had tripled in value since he bought it in the 80s. A modest investment portfolio he had built slowly over decades. A small pension, some savings bonds. Total value, when everything was appraised, just under $1.9 million. He left all of it to me. There were no other beneficiaries. He had no siblings still living, no children other than me. His will was simple, clear, drafted by a solicitor in New Westminster 12 years before his death, and updated once, 5 years later, to reflect the sale of his car and the addition of some RSP accounts. I was his daughter. He said so in the will, plainly, in language that left no room for ambiguity. He used my full legal name, the name I had taken when the adoption was finalized when I was 7 years old, standing in a courtroom in Burnaby in my good dress while a judge stamped a document and Bernard squeezed my hand. I thought that was the end of it, the clean, sad, administratively manageable end of grief. I was wrong. The letter arrived 4 months after Bernard's death. It was addressed to me at my office, forwarded from the probate court. The return address was a law firm in Calgary I had never heard of. I read it twice. Then I set it down on my desk and looked at the window for a long time. My biological parents were contesting the estate. Their position, as laid out by their lawyer in language that was very careful and very wrong, was that the adoption had been improperly processed, that there were procedural irregularities in the original placement, that as my biological parents, they retained a legal and moral claim to any inheritance I received from a guardian figure during my minority. It was a creative argument. It was also almost entirely without legal foundation in British Columbia, but creativity is not the same as correctness, and someone had convinced them, or they had convinced themselves, that there was money to be made here. $1.9 million. The house, the investments, the savings bonds, all of it. I sat with that letter for a week before I told anyone. I told my colleague Priya first because she is sharp and because I trusted her not to react with more emotion than was useful. She read it and said, "This is going to be dismissed at first instance?" And I said, "I know." And she said, "But it's still going to cost you time and money and energy, and it's going to be awful." And I said, "Yes." She was right on all counts. I need to tell you something about my biological parents, the things I pieced together over the years, because this next part will not make sense without it. When I was 24, I requested my original CAS file. It took several months and a great deal of paperwork, and I had to prepare myself for what I might find, which I did by running 10 kilometers on a Saturday morning and then sitting on my kitchen floor eating cereal directly from the box. The file confirmed what I had already suspected, that my abandonment was not impulsive or accidental, that my parents had financial difficulties that had been escalating for 2 years before the airport, that there is a note in the file from an investigating officer indicating that the departure from Vancouver that morning appeared to be deliberate and pre-planned. There is also a note that is harder to read. My biological parents had a life insurance policy taken out in my name, a small one, the kind marketed to families as a financial planning tool, and in the months after I was reported missing, they filed a claim against it. They told the insurance company I had wandered away from them in the airport and that despite extensive searching, I had never been found. They described it as a disappearance. They collected a settlement. The exact figure is redacted in the records I was given, but my lawyer was later able to obtain it through the discovery process, and then they moved on with their lives. They had another child, a son. He would have been born about 2 years after I was left at the airport. He had no idea any of this had happened. I want to be clear about that. What I'm telling you is that my biological parents did not just abandon me, they monetized my disappearance. They reported me as missing, presumed lost, and collected money because of it. They went to Calgary and started over and had a second family, and presumably told themselves some story about that Tuesday morning that they could live with. And then, 30 years later, when there was money on the table again, they came back. The claim was filed in the BC Supreme Court. It was the kind of filing that has to be answered even when the answer is obvious, because the court system requires it. I retained a litigator, someone outside my firm, because I was not going to represent myself in anything this personal, and we began the long, grinding work of responding. I did not recuse from my regular work during this period. I had cases of my own. Life did not stop. What I did not tell my biological parents' lawyer, what I had no legal obligation to tell him, was that I had recently been appointed to the bench, that the appointment had come through just 6 weeks before Bernard died, and that I had taken a brief leave from private practice to grieve before beginning my new role, that I was, as of that month, a judge of the BC Supreme Court, and that the clerk of the court, when assigning matters, had placed this particular estate dispute on my docket. This is the part that requires some explanation, because I know what it sounds like. In a normal circumstance, a judge would recuse, remove themselves from any matter in which they have a personal interest. That is not a suggestion. It is a rule. It is the foundation of a fair legal system, and I believe in it absolutely. What I did was this. I disclosed the conflict immediately and fully to the Chief Justice. I put it in writing. I explained my relationship to the matter, my history with the parties, and the nature of the claim. I expected to be recused. The Chief Justice reviewed the disclosure and conferred with 2 other senior judges. Their determination, not mine, I want to be very precise about this, was that because my biological parents had no legal parental status in any BC jurisdiction, and because the adoption had been fully finalized under a court order that had never been challenged in the 30 years since it was issued, I was not a party to the proceeding in the legal sense that would require recusal. The estate belonged to me. The claimants were strangers. She could have overruled that determination. She chose not to. I was assigned to hear the matter. The morning of the hearing, I arrived at the courthouse on Smythe Street at 7:45. I went through my notes. I had coffee in my chambers. I was calm in the way that comes not from the absence of feeling, but from having processed something so thoroughly that it no longer has the power to knock you sideways. The bailiff called the room to order. I came in through the side door. I sat down. I looked at the papers in front of me, and then I looked up. My biological mother had gone a little gray. My biological father had a beard now, white, and was heavier through the middle. They looked like people who had lived ordinary lives in a provincial city for 30 years and had not spent much time thinking about what they had left behind. Sitting beside them was their lawyer, a man I didn't recognize, younglish, slightly underprepared in the way that sometimes happens when someone has taken a case they shouldn't have. Their lawyer was arranging his notes. He did not look up when I entered. My biological mother did. I watched her face. I kept my own face still. Judicial temperament is something you cultivate deliberately, and I had been cultivating it for years. I am told I am very good at it. She looked at me, then she looked away, then she looked back. I could see the moment it happened. The recognition moving through her like a slow current, starting in her eyes and traveling down to her mouth, which opened slightly and then closed again. 30 years is a long time. I was no longer 6 years old in a red coat, but something in the face apparently persists, something she knew. She touched her husband's arm. I saw her lean toward him. I saw his eyes come up to find mine. I let the silence hold for exactly as long as the protocol required. Then I said, "Good morning. This is the hearing for estate of Bernard Calloway, contested by the claimants. Counsel, are you ready to proceed?" The lawyer for the claimants said yes. His voice was slightly uncertain. My own lawyer said yes, clearly. "Then we'll begin," I said. I will not describe the hearing in full. It lasted most of the morning. The legal arguments were what I had expected. A thin case built on procedural language and wishful thinking, the kind of claim that sometimes succeeds simply because the other side lacks the resources to fight it. I had the resources, I had retained good counsel, and we had prepared thoroughly. What I will tell you is the moment that mattered. My lawyer called a witness. She was a woman in her early 60s, a former CAS caseworker who had been involved in my placement and who had subsequently become a child welfare advocate. She had agreed to testify about the original file and the circumstances of the adoption. My biological mother's lawyer objected to her testimony on relevance grounds. I overruled the objection, calmly, on the record. The witness testified. She described what she had found in 1994. She described the airport. She described a 6-year-old girl standing alone by a pillar holding a rabbit with one floppy ear. She described the investigation that followed and the conclusion that the abandonment had been deliberate. And then my lawyer asked her to describe what the investigating officer had found regarding the life insurance claim. The courtroom was very quiet. My biological father's face had gone the color of uncooked pastry. The witness described the claim, the amount, $42,000, the circumstances, the determination by the original investigator that the claim appeared to have been made fraudulently based on the fact that a living child had been placed in provincial care and no report had been made to correct the record. She explained that no charges had been laid at the time due to jurisdictional and resource limitations, and that the file had been closed. My lawyer let that sit. Then she said, "Would it be accurate to say, in your professional opinion, that the claimants in this matter profited financially from the abandonment of the child they are now claiming to have a parental relationship with?" The lawyer for the claimants was on his feet with an objection before she finished the sentence. I looked at him. I let him make his objection fully. Then I said, "I'll allow the question. The witness may answer." The witness said, "Yes. In my professional opinion, that is accurate." I ruled from the bench that afternoon. The claim was dismissed in its entirety. I found that the claimants had no standing, that the adoption order was valid and had never been legally challenged, and that their asserted parental relationship had been legally extinguished 30 years prior by a court of competent jurisdiction. I noted on the record the testimony regarding the insurance claim and indicated that I was referring the matter to the BC Securities and Insurance Commission as well as the RCMP for review of potential fraud. I am not a prosecutor. What happens next is not in my hands. But it is in motion. My biological parents' lawyer asked for a recess at one point during my ruling. I granted it. In the hallway, according to my own lawyer, my biological mother sat on a bench near the water fountain and did not speak for 10 minutes. I don't know what she was thinking. I have stopped trying to guess. After the ruling, I sat in my chambers for a long time before changing out of my robes. I thought about Bernard. I thought about the vegetable garden in Coquitlam, the way he would come in from it in the late afternoon with dirt on his hands and a look of complete contentment, like a man who had found the exact right scale for his life. I thought about the public speaking award and the box of crayons in the airport office and the stuffed rabbit, which I still have, sitting on a shelf in my home office with its one floppy ear. I thought about what he told me once, when I was in law school and very tired and questioning whether I had chosen the right path. He said, "You're not doing this to win. You're doing this because someone has to understand how the system works and care enough to use it properly." He said, "That's rarer than you'd think." I didn't feel triumphant that afternoon. I want to be honest about that, because I think it would be easy to tell this story as a victory and leave it there. But what I felt was more like the end of a long carry. The particular exhaustion that comes from putting down something heavy you've been holding for so long, you'd forgotten you were holding it. My biological parents had, in the end, given me one thing without meaning to. By leaving me at that airport, they had put me in the path of a man who taught me that being left behind does not mean you are not worth staying for. Everything I have, my career, my home, the quiet life I have built with real intention, comes from that, from him. I used a portion of Bernard's estate to establish a fund for the BC Children's Foundation. It supports legal advocacy for children in long-term foster care, children who age out of the system without a permanent placement, without a Bernard, without the particular luck that I had. I named it after him, privately, without announcement, without a press release. There's a plaque in a small office in New Westminster with his name on it. He would have been mildly embarrassed by that, and also secretly pleased. I know this because I knew him. He was my father. He chose me, deliberately, with full information, and he stayed. That is what staying looks like. I have been trying to live up to it ever since. I think about the vegetable garden a lot. Not the courtroom, not the ruling, not the look on my biological mother's face when she realized who was sitting behind that bench. The garden. Bernard coming in through the back door with dirt on his hands, and that quiet expression he had, like a man who had found exactly the right size for his life and was content to stay inside it. That image is what I come back to when I try to make sense of everything that happened. There's a version of the story that's about justice, about systems working the way they're supposed to, about wrongs being corrected after 30 years, and I won't pretend that part doesn't matter, because it does. The referral to the RCMP matters. The dismissed claim matters. The fact that what my biological parents did, leaving a 6-year-old alone in an airport and then filing an insurance claim as though she had simply ceased to exist, is now on record officially in a court of law. That matters. But the thing I keep coming back to isn't the outcome, it's the choices that produced it. My biological parents made a choice in 1994. They made it deliberately, over time, with planning, and they made another choice 30 years later when they saw money on a table and decided they had some claim to it. Both choices came from the same place, a willingness to treat another person as a resource rather than a human being. That is not a failure of circumstance. It is a failure of character. And character, in my experience, compounds. What you choose to do when no one is watching, when it costs you something, when the easier path is right there, that accumulates. It builds the person you become. It built them, and it built me. Bernard never talked about himself as a good person. He would have found that embarrassing, but he made choices every single day that required something of him: patience, honesty, showing up when it would have been easier not to. He drove me to every appointment. He sat through every difficult conversation without flinching. He told me the truth about my history when I was old enough to hear it because he believed I deserved accurate information about my own life. Those weren't grand gestures. They were small, repeated acts of integrity, and they were the foundation of everything. I built a career on trying to understand how systems fail people and how to use those systems more carefully. That required years of work that was often unglamorous and exhausting. It required sitting with information that was hard to hold and thinking clearly anyway. It required not letting what happened to me at 6 years old become a reason to stop trying. I am not going to pretend that was easy. It wasn't. But I had a model for it. I had Bernard, who had faced his own grief, real, devastating grief, and decided the most useful thing he could do was turn towards someone else who needed steadiness. That is what I tried to carry forward. The fund in his name is part of it. The work is part of it, but mostly it's the daily practice of choosing, even when it costs something, to be the kind of person who stays. The people who left me at that airport gave me one thing they didn't intend to. They put me exactly where I needed to be to find the person who would show me what that looks like. I have been trying to live up to it ever since.